So the first thing, it's funny, I read and reread the way this conference was framed. And it's just so interesting, but not so uncommon, that it falls into the two most common traps of the way liberal thought deals with the problem of religion. The first trap is to group religion together, that the problem is religion. And okay, religious diversity, but all these religions are the same, and the question is how much secularity, more or less, to deal with the problem of religious people living amongst us. And even if we focus only on the Abrahamic religions, on the three monotheistic religions, of Abrahamic origin, in some fundamental respects they are so different from each other that a solution that would deal with problems of religion that would fit the Jews will not fit the Christians, or fit the Christians and not... So in some fundamental sense they're similar and very different from a secular worldview, because all these religions accept the notion of the sacred and the holy, which are two concepts which simply do not exist in a secular worldview. There is no meaning to the words holiness and sacredness in a secular worldview. But in other respects, they are very, very different and in pertinent ways to how we deal with the issue. When you tell a Jew in France, to pick up that example, you cannot be a French Jew, you have to be a Jewish Frenchman, it's not just a different type of political theory. It's negating a fundamental tenet of a religious Jew's religious identity, because his religious identity tells him you have to be a French Jew and not a Jewish Frenchman. So it's not sort of some kind of difference of organizing it. It is actually a benign or less benign assault on a religious precept in a way which for Christians is totally different. The Christian revolution of St. Paul was to say there's no longer Jew or Gentile, male or female, freedman or slave, we are all saved in the Lord Jesus Christ. It is exactly in that respect the opposite of that peoplehood concept, religious concept of peoplehood, and it dejects it and said, so just to give you that one example. Now, if we talk now, we take it to relations, church and state and society, there's not going to be an easy solution that fits Jews and fits Christians. And I can give you examples, a glory that would also illustrate this with relation to differences between Christianity and Islam and Judaism, etc. The second thing is to somehow treat secularism as being in a different conceptual plane than the religion. So the problem is religion, and the possible range of solutions are more or less secularism, as if it's something different. But it may once have been something different, but in a world where the major cleavage is not between Protestants and Catholics, but between religious people and non-religious people, it's very helpful sometimes to think of secularism in the same way as we think about religion. Let me illustrate this. So I want, from a sociological point of view, to discuss religious intolerance. What are the features of religious intolerance? First of all, it's well-intentioned. I have the way to save you. I have the way to save the world. It's not pernicious. It can have pernicious effects, but it starts from a well-intentioned position. And secondly, it's paternalistic, or what Marxists would call, it's premised on false consciousness. I know the real truth, the religious person says, and the fact that you don't recognize it, it's just because of false consciousness. If you really understood deeply life, you would understand that the real way is the way I'm showing you. So you can only be saved in Jesus Christ, Christianity says. And if you don't get that, we have to work on you, and eventually you will get that. Maybe the moment before you die, you will see the truth, etc. So in religious intolerance, there's a deep streak of paternalistic and self-consciousness premise. The third one, in subtle or unsubtle ways, it's condescending. I might recognize that you have your own beliefs, etc., but somehow my beliefs are superior to yours. And the minute it gets the opportunity, it's coercive. So religion which gets power becomes coercive because of the three previous features. We have the truth, it's a well-intentioned truth, we will save the world, we know the truth better than you do. And now that we have the power, it's not only our right, it's our duty to do it. It's a sociological take on religious intolerance, it's not a religious take on it. Now, in a biblical worldview, or a worldview that goes well, at least in the West, up to the Enlightenment and even beyond, the word religion doesn't have significance, because everybody, you can be an idolater. But what does it mean not to have a religious worldview? You either reject, but that's the worldview. Religion becomes a meaningful concept when we live in a world in which you can either be religious or secular. And if I look now at, if we have, say, at the foundation of the United States, so basically everybody is presumed to be religious, even if you're not Christian, you're a deist. And if everybody is religious, just different forms and types of religion, to be secular has some claim to neutrality. But if you live in a world in which, as it is much more today, in which the cleavage is mostly between a religious worldview and practice and a non-religious worldview, the secular is no more neutral than the religious. And that form of secularism takes on all the features of religious intolerance. It is well-intentioned. Liberalism is really the best way that societies can organize themselves. It is paternalistic, even if you don't see it. History teaches us that this is the way, and so it is. Eventually you will come to understand it. It is condescending, because both as an empirical observation, but also even in a conceptual sense. Well, it's okay for you to be a vegetarian, it's okay for you to collect matchboxes, and it's also okay for you to be religious, but please keep it in your home. And there's a certain condescension of secularists towards religious people. Somehow, I remember Tom Nagel saying to me, he says to me, how is it possible that such an intelligent person like yourself is religious? It's just hard to understand how you can be both seriously intelligent and also religious and religiously observant. And it's coercive, because we use the power of the states to impose a religious worldview. So suddenly we find that secularism it takes on itself the very features of religious intolerance. And it may be useful when we tackle these problems, instead of saying the problem is religious diversity and secularism is a way of dealing with it, to understand that there's a form of secularism, and it's far more common than we are sometimes willing to admit, which should just be thought about as the way we think about certain types of religion. It's a religion, it's a faith, and it has the intolerant tendencies of historical religion. And often I think to myself, the most illiberal liberalism is the worst form of illiberalism because of its conceit. A take on neutrality. A take on neutrality. To have a wall without a crucifix is neutral. To have a wall with a crucifix is not neutral. If the state has to be neutral, it should remove the crucifix from the wall. It's so intuitive, isn't it? How can you even argue with it? But that is not the practice in our society. Because in our societies, like France, where of course there could not be a crucifix on the wall, there can be any other symbol with an ideological content on the wall. If you put a Mickey Mouse, there's an ideological content there. If you put a nuclear-free society sign, which is permitted, there's an ideological content. In every primary French school, when you walk in, you will have above the door, liberté, égalité, fraternité. I would love my kids to go to a school which has that above the door. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. But I would never think of teaching my children that that is a neutral position. I would say that is a value-laden proposition which is even worth fighting for. But I wouldn't teach them that that is neutrality. So you can have any manner of symbol on the walls of your schools in the secular laic state, except a religious one. A religion is toxic. I don't call that neutral. I am totally comfortable with the laic France. It's a worldview which says religion should be confined to the private space. It has no place in the public space. The state cannot endorse, finance, etc. religion. It's a legitimate position to adopt, but conceptually it's not any different from a United Kingdom with an established religion. The established religion of France is secularism. And they use the instruments of the state to enforce that form of understanding of a worldview, and the measure will be the extent to which they coerce others into that worldview. And in the same way that we would assess Christianity in an established church state like Britain, it's not the fact that there is an established church. It's what they do with the power they have, what they do in terms of the worldview they have. And again, I will echo something that was said before me. Most religious people probably feel more comfortable and safe in a moderate theocracy like the United Kingdom, or like Denmark, where Lutheranism is the established religion of the state, or like Greece, where there are two things that happen. First, they feel there is an actual deep understanding of religiosity. And secondly, even though they are Christians, if they are willing to accept me as a Muslim, that is real tolerance. Then in a laic state like France, where although there's no discrimination among religions, but there's probably subtle forms of discrimination against religion, at least from a social point of view, etc. So what I'm trying to say, in 13 minutes and 13 seconds.
You said
what I'm trying
to... I didn't.
No, I'm teasing.
I'm giving you more freedom.
No. That would be...
You're saying such wonderful things.
That's discriminatory. We can't tolerate that, can we? So what I'm trying to say is that I would incorporate secularism, at least in the form which is very prevalent in our Western society, alongside religion. And to say that it's natural in democracies that a democracy and a majority will privilege the majority worldview, whether it's a laic worldview or an Anglican worldview or whatever it might be. And the question is to all of them, to what extent will you use the legitimate privilege of the majority to privilege the democratically held worldview? To what extent will you press it to an extent that will make others who do not share that worldview uncomfortable with that kind of power that you exercise? And I think in and of itself, it's totally unexceptional. I have no problem with France constitutionally establishing itself as a laic state, or with Britain constitutionally or Denmark constitutionally establishing themselves as a state with an established religion. That is fine with me. I don't have a conceptual problem. It doesn't negate liberalism for me. It doesn't negate democracy. I just want to see how far they will press their advantage in it.